Hello and welcome to Lamestream, a show that guides you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing really, really well. I've got a question for you, Oz. The reason will become apparent in a second, but what's your favorite snack, would you say?
You know the answer to this question. It's the snack that I have played a critical role in maintaining its existence in Australia. It is the humble kettle chili chip.
Well, you know why. You just jumped the gun on why I am asking this question, Oz, is this week people might have seen taxpayers are giving this $45 million loan to Arnott's. And I reckon one of my favorite snacks is Jats. You know, you can dress it down, you can dress it up, you can make it fancy. I don't know if you've ever put like a delicious like pickled mussel or something on a Jats. It goes high and it goes low.
I
love that
you've
about
done
Jats.
that for me. I think you've given me
Oh,
very fancy Jats snacks.
delicious. And I just don't understand how a company can lose money selling Jats. They're like crack, let alone Tim Tams, Monte Carlos. I mean, look, I don't want to talk about the sort of bailout loan thing. I think if it's that important to bail out, we should just nationalize Arnott's and take this essential resource of biscuits and crackers to the people. But the whole reason I wanted to bring this up was, your background in helping save another iconic Australian snack, as you say, the kettle chili chip. How the hell is Osman Faruqi intimately woven with Australia's favourite chili chip?
Yeah, look, a while ago they said they were going to stop making these chili chips. I launched an online campaign to keep them around. And look, we didn't need taxpayer dollars back then. Just humble grassroots organizing. And then the great folk at Kettle listened. They kept the chili chips around. And that is how we did things back in my day, before everyone thought, you know, you just rocked up, knocked on the door of the government and got an industry assistance package. I know you said you don't want to talk about bailouts and loans, and I know that this isn't a podcast about bailouts and loans or Arnott's or Tim Tams or snacks, but what are we doing? Like, we really think $45 million is a good use of taxpayer money? If these guys can't keep Tim Tams alive, clearly, like, the company is struggling. These are very popular biscuits, not to mention Jats. Like, how are they losing money selling Australians
I know.
Tim Tams? It's ridiculous.
I know. That's why I think nationalize it. I don't know how these clowns can be losing money selling Jats and Monte Carlos and Tim Tams and Ginger Snaps. It's like, get out of here. Anyway.
Add that to the list of things that should be nationalised. Banks, airlines, and the manufacturing of Australia's favourite biscuits.
Absolutely.
Scott, we've got a couple of announcements before we get into today's show. Over summer, we're going to be releasing some special episodes. We don't want to give away too much yet, but they're going to be some pretty fun conversations. One episode we are keen to do is a mailbag episode where we answer all of your questions. But to do that, we need your questions. They can be questions about the topics we cover on the show, news, media, politics. They can be questions about the show itself. They can even be questions about Scott and I, our work, our lives, whatever. We'd love it if you wrote in. You can DM us on Instagram at LamestreamPod, or send us an email at lamestream.com.au. And speaking of lamestream.com.au, a reminder that our special summer sale on subscriptions is on right now. A bunch of you have already jumped on. Welcome to Team Lamestream, and thank you very much. Up until Christmas, we're offering 15% off the price of annual subscriptions. So go get one for yourself, get one for a friend. It's a great way to support the show. Get access to all of our articles, ad-free versions of the podcast, and a whole bunch more. Scott, where can people go if they want to subscribe?
They can go to lamestream.com.au, and Oz, you know, we can only make this podcast because of our subscribers. All of our subscribers help us make this every week, but we don't want to just take your support. We have broken so many exclusive yarns. All these articles are up there exclusive for subscribers. We've done so much original journalism. There's weekly recommendations, weekly newsletters, ad-free versions of the show. We're trying to give subscribers as much value as we can, and we're keeping working at it. So it's a great time to hop on while the sale is going.
Absolutely is. All right, today on Lamestream, even though you aren't reading about it in most of the Australian media, Israel is continuing its slaughter. It's ramping up its bombings of Lebanon in total and flagrant breach of the ceasefire with that country. And now several Israeli politicians have made a series of very, very disturbing announcements suggesting that Israel could be set to step up its ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Scott is going to dive into the latest deeply unsettling statements coming from Netanyahu and his political allies and ask why they're not being reported in the Australian media. Plus, we'll cover the Eurovision boycott announced by some countries and look at why Australia isn't part of that campaign. Later in the show, Australian ministers Penny Wong and Richard Marles travelled to the US this week to pledge allegiance to Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth and commit billions and billions of our dollars to the US war machine. Their trip was covered quite extensively, but what got a lot less attention in Australia was the White House's new national security strategy, which fundamentally reshapes the entire global order by aligning the US more closely to Russia, singling out migration as the greatest threat to the West's security, and promising US support to far-right parties across Europe. It's a hugely significant announcement that hasn't been discussed anywhere near enough as it should have been in Australia. So we're going to be doing that work ourselves on this episode.
And in keeping tabs, a check-in on the social media ban, Oz, now that it is here, it is enforced. And a look at the trouble that one minister responsible for it, Annika Wells, has gotten herself into over her use of parliamentary expenses just as the big social media ban she's responsible for rolls out. Plus, Oz, a look at the latest developments in the Warner Brothers sale we discussed on Monday, and people will never guess who has launched a Substack and joined the newsletter revolution. Should we get into it?
Let's get into it.
Oz, we've talked about how politicians, media organisations, all these groups want to stop talking about Gaza now that there's this ceasefire in place. It's given them an excuse to do that, to look away, despite Gazans being gunned down still pretty much every day by Israeli troops. But this week, I became a little incensed at the events going on that are just not getting covered. I want to begin with Benjamin Netanyahu and some comments he made at the start of the week, which I couldn't find, by the way, reported by the ABC or the Nine papers or a lot of big Australian news organisations. These comments were made in a press conference with the German Chancellor who was visiting Israel, and Germany's been a huge supporter of Netanyahu's government throughout the last 2 years. Here is the quote that grabbed my attention.
The one thing that we will always insist upon is that the sovereign power of security from the Jordan River, which is right here, to the Mediterranean Sea, which is right there, that will always remain in Israel's hands.
Does that sound similar to anything, Oz? A phrase, maybe, that the media has become very consumed by in the last 2 years?
Yeah, he's obviously trying to hijack the phrase from the river to the sea and do it in a way that is both like trolling the pro-Palestine movement and his kind of awareness of how that phrase has been vilified and you know, turned into this alleged anti-Semitic phrase. So he's kind of doing that at the same time as he's using it to actually talk about genocidal, insane things that kind of conservatives and pro-Israel figures have been saying in a way that pro-Israel figures have accused the pro-Palestine campaigners of using it. This is incredible that he just goes out and says it and seemingly like no one gets mad about it, Scott. It's crazy.
Exactly. And to unpack the significance of what he's saying there, you know, when protesters say from the river to the sea, something that, you know, has been branded anti-Semitic in the media, crucially they follow that sentence with Palestine will be free. And I don't want to get into the whole argument about that phrase, but I'd just say that even journalists like your Chip Legrands or Patricia Karvelis's, who have given space to the idea that that phrase is anti-Semitic, would have to acknowledge that it's from a place of calling for freedoms, and that's because Palestinians, Arabs, whether they're in the occupied territories or in Israel, they are subject to different laws. They have different rights to Jewish people who live in that land. Netanyahu here is not accompanying that phrase with any kind of call for freedom, call for for rights, call for anything like that. He is purely using that to say that Israel wants the total right to use force in all of that land to bomb and kill anyone from the river to the sea. Like, whenever they see fit, they will never let a Palestinian state that controls its borders ever exist. That is genocidal. But this week, Oz did not read a Chip Legrand or a Patricia Karvelis or any Australian commentator who's criticised that phrase, asked questions about it, turned their lens on Netanyahu and that kind of rhetoric this week. These comments didn't even really get reported.
It sort of feels like an alternative universe now, the last 2 years, where there was a moral panic anytime anyone used this phrase. Like, it's almost a joke now to reference Patricia Karvelis and Chip Legrand losing their minds, but these are some of the most powerful and like well-read figures in the Australian media who whipped up controversy after controversy. People were fired. People were demonized. Laws were passed about this bullshit accusation that protesters using that phrase in their opposition to apartheid and genocide were anti-Semitic. And now Netanyahu just says it as a way to justify indiscriminate killings, and it's crickets. It's astonishing that this is where we are in Australia right now.
Totally. And I'm not just highlighting like that I think it should be covered for this rhetorical reason, Oz. This press conference was full of news, like including Netanyahu for the first time laying out his vision of what he called the second phase of this assault on Gaza, which he said would be the dismantling of Hamas, which would then be followed by another third phase he described as a de-radicalization program across Gaza, which he compared to the denazification of post-war Germany. Now that might sound kind of benign, Oz, de-radicalization, but like what he's talking about here, I think will be brutal. We saw it in Iraq. The US said they would do this after they invaded. They called it de-Baathification after the party that Saddam Hussein led. And what it actually meant to, strip away a party, to completely remove it from society, is the US, they cleansed the entire society of party members who, in some cases, were just school teachers, academics, civil engineers. They stripped them from public life. People were abducted, jailed, tortured, cleansed the whole of society. And by the end of it, Iraq had no one left to run the institutions of the country. It set that country back decades. And if anyone has any doubt about this, like I can't predict the future, maybe I'm going off the rails, another story that did not really get reported here, Oz, that has driven me bananas, is the far-right genocidal National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has had a huge win lately. He advanced legislation that would let Israeli authorities execute non-Jewish prisoners, and after 2 more readings of that bill, it'll become law. Now, why do we think
non-Jewish prisoners? I thought there's no apartheid in Israel. You're telling me there are different laws that apply based on someone's race, ethnicity, religion? What? But you can't say it's apartheid, Scott. You'll get drummed out of journalism. You'll be drawn and quartered by the Australian political and media establishment. What are you talking about?
Exactly. Good point. Good point. And why
I've lost my mind. If people can't tell, I've lost my fucking mind hearing you talk about all this stuff. It's crazy what's going on.
And, to explain why he is advancing these laws, he gave us one reason this week. Ben-Gvir said this week that if the Palestinians or the UN move forward with recognizing a Palestinian state, then, quote, targeted assassinations of senior Palestinian Authority officials who are terrorists for all intents and purposes should be ordered, end quote. To remind everyone, it is currently Australia's policy to recognise a Palestinian state. Yeah. Ben-Gvir is literally saying, if Australia, countries like Australia, pursue this, we'll kill a bunch of Palestinians, a bunch of Palestinian politicians. Like, if you vote for your stated policy at the UN, we will kill Palestinians. That is blackmail. But this is our ally. We are still shipping weapons to them every week, just like 2 weeks ago, as reported by Declassified Australia. And the government has not issued like our government has not issued a single statement condemning this. It's nowhere in our media. We're supposed to just support this with taxpayer dollars all the time. It is mind-boggling to me that an ally can talk like that if the world moves forward with this, will kill people. That is just outrageous to me, Oz.
It's outrageous. And, we're people who are quite cynical about the state of politics and media. It's a big part of, why we make this show. But even still, even with that deep cynicism, I remain quite stunned and blown away at just how little attention anyone is paying to this. Like, the Israeli government is literally saying, this is stage 2 and stage 3 that we're planning of this, as what they call the assault on Gaza, which we all know as the genocide in Gaza. And it's almost entirely absent from media coverage. And in some outlets, it is entirely absent. And in some other outlets, it's just vague wire stories about, occasionally Israel will bomb Lebanon or be accused of testing the ceasefire. But so little to the point of non-existent, like detailed reportage of what the government is doing to Arabs and Palestinians in Israel and what they are planning on doing in the West Bank and Gaza. It's astonishing, and it's yet another abrogation of just the very fundamental responsibilities that these outlets have to tell us about what's going on in this war as they continue to defend and run cover for Australia's alliance with Israel and our support of them economically and militarily.
And just like Ben, I've got to tell you, I was like, through this whole thing, Ben Gvir is being so grotesque about this execution law. Like, it would be such a huge story if any other ally of Australia was behaving this way. When the legislation was moved for the first reading in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, Ben Gvir handed out sweets in the chamber to celebrate this execution of non-Jews bill being read. He has been wearing a golden pin of a noose on his jacket.
That's crazy.
Yeah, through all of the, parliamentary hearings and things they're doing it. And he's bragging about the fact that 110 Palestinians have died in jail since he took over the prisons portfolio. He's bragging about how happy he is that 110 people have died in custody. It is just staggering to me.
So what's going on in Israel is there's so many instances, it's not attracting the kind of, I guess, imagery that wholesale bombings do, but it is a insidious and very dark escalation of the country, and in particular this government's attempts to eradicate the Palestinian people by all means necessary. But in Australia, everyone is just acting like it's all back to normal. We've talked about this on the show. The genocide raised these really uncomfortable questions about the media and government's complicity. They don't want to spotlight their own cowardice and complicity on this. They've just taken the ceasefire as an excuse to move on from the story and just kind of never really look back. They're like, oh, thank God we got through that. It was pretty tough. Now we can just pretend it's all over. That seems to be what's going on. I got to say, Scott, though, it's kind of not just them. Right? Like, I thought this at the time. I was very bewildered by the decision to just stop and essentially shut down the pro-Palestine protest movement. It was announced via an Instagram post a couple of days after the last rally. When the ceasefire was confirmed, it seemed obvious that there were going to be continuing issues, not just with actual breaches of the ceasefire, but with Israel's ongoing attempts to kill, murder, and eradicate Palestinians and expel them from their land. And people might want to put pressure on the government. I thought it was very bizarre that the movement just sort of seemed to wrap up. I thought that was a strategic mistake. I think that's been borne out to be the case. There is no pressure left really being put on institutions in this country to do something for the people of Gaza, even as Israel is ramping up its attacks on Palestinians and its erasure of Palestinian territory. There is, Scott, internationally, though, quite significant pro-Palestine campaigns occurring. One of those is focused around Eurovision, the international singing competition that, for some reason, includes non-European countries like Israel and Australia. Ireland, the Netherlands, Slovenia, and Spain have announced that they will boycott the competition next year after the European Broadcasting Union, the body that runs Eurovision, confirmed Israel's participation. It's actually the biggest boycott in the competition's history. It's had a long political history, Eurovision, and there have been boycotts every now and then. This is the most number of countries that have boycotted at one particular time. And the decision from those countries came after the Broadcasting Union refused to hold a vote on Israel's participation. That's because Israel has very, very strong supporters among some European countries. You mentioned Germany's strong support of Israel and Netanyahu earlier. Germany said that they were going to withdraw if Israel was kicked out. Other countries like the UK and Sweden said politics should not impact Eurovision, which is so obviously insane because it always has impacted Eurovision, but very specifically a crazy line because in 2022, they all kicked out Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. Like, there is literal precedence in the last 3 years for doing this, and they've all just pretended that didn't happen. But still, the boycott from those 4 countries is really significant, and it shows the role that governments and public broadcasters, like media companies with journalists, can play in an international campaign against Israel's genocide. Which brings us to Australia. You know, we are part of Eurovision. Our national broadcast partner for Eurovision is SBS. They're an associate member of the European Broadcasting Union. They've confirmed that they won't be boycotting, and they've been the subject of protests, including protests attended by former Australian entrants to Eurovision, like Montaigne. SBS's statement on this is interesting, Scott. Here's what they said. They said, Eurovision was created to bring together people through music, a purpose that continues to guide the contest and has shaped SBS's broadcast for more than 40 years. Our position remains that as a public broadcaster, making a decision to be involved on the inclusion or exclusion of any country would undermine SBS's editorial independence, impartiality. Would undermine SBS's editorial independence and impartiality. I'll be very honest, Scott. I think that's bullshit for a number of reasons, right?
Yeah.
First, this idea that as a public broadcaster, we can't make any decisions. I don't think SBS has a better grasp of editorial independence and impartiality than like RTE, the Irish broadcaster, or the Dutch or Spanish public broadcasters. In fact, knowing what I know about SBS, I would trust those public broadcasters and their commitment to independence and impartiality a hell of a lot more. Secondly, choosing to participate in Eurovision, right, which is an active choice SBS is making. Choosing to participate when Israel is competing is a political act. It's not, you know, you don't just get to say it's not political when we choose. You don't get to say it's political if we don't participate. It's also political when you choose to participate in this current context. And finally, to go back to the Russia example, SBS had no problem being part of the European Broadcasting Union when it kicked out Russia and continues to participate in Eurovision with Russia kicked out. So they are very happy, obviously, to make political decisions when it suits them. It's just kind of a ridiculous line from my perspective from SBS.
Oh, it is. It does sound like a total joke. I mean, a little insight into this is there's on the SBS board now a guy named Vic Alhadeff who's on it, and Vic Alhadeff for many years was probably the most connected and influential pro-Israel lobbyist in the country. As someone who worked at SBS, I know that he was actually pretty influential at SBS before he ever was on that board. I remember I produced an episode of Insight about Iran, and I don't think we had anyone from the Iranian government on the show, but we had two former heads of the Mossad on the show, and Vic, who was in the green room, went absolutely ballistic and was furious during the episode about balance. In an episode on Iran, if you have 2 heads of the Mossad on the show and that isn't balanced enough for you, I think that shows his opinion on these things. Not that I know whether Vic Alhadeff had any influence over SBS's decision-making on this, or I have no idea, but I would just suggest that when that guy is on the board, people know, in the organization, know what kind of things will run afoul of someone like that.
Yeah, I mean, like, let's be honest, Scott. We don't have any hard evidence on this, but, like, you're going to put one of the most well-known Zionist pro-Israel figures on the board of SBS, and you're going to tell us that has no impact on how SBS may choose to cover the issues regarding Israel. I mean, we focus a lot on the ABC, but honestly, the SBS board has a lot to answer for. I know a couple of people on the SBS board. I'm not going to name them here, but come on, guys. You know, pull your fucking fingers out. You run a public broadcaster that has debased itself for the last 2 years and is now too cowardly to do. Like, these Ireland, Spain, the Netherlands, Slovenia, these are not like insane, anti-Semitic countries run by crazy terrorists. These are just very normal, boring, in some cases, conservative countries. It's just yet another example of how Australia is just so far behind the ball on having any kind of courage or political will on this issue. The last thing I wanted to say, Scott, on this topic, I still remain very confused about what happened to what was one of the biggest and most passionate social movements I've seen in Australia in my time, alive and active in kind of politics and media in this country. There is an event that a few friends of the podcast are putting together at the end of the year. It's called a Gathering for Gaza. It's a fundraiser to raise money for Palestine, to raise money for a bunch of different charities, including MSF and Olive Kids, who are operating in Gaza and in the occupied territories. It's a great, great event. The lineup is actually pretty amazing. It's a musical event along with some speakers, artists like Angie McMahon, Julia Jacqueline, Genesis Owusu, Cut Copy. All of the money is going to a great cause. You can just search for a Gathering for Gaza and buy tickets. I think it's a great event, and it's a really good idea to get the artistic creative communities together and do something for the people of Gaza. All right, after the break, a look at the new shift in US foreign policy that formally aligns the country with the global far right, and why Australian politicians and journalists don't seem to care. Scott, there's a couple of things going on with our relationship to the United States that I think are worth discussing this week. The first is this trip that Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Defense Minister Richard Marles made to the US at the beginning of the week. They met with their counterparts, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of War Crimes Pete Hegseth. A big focus was AUKUS. Hegseth said he applauded Australia's upcoming delivery of an additional $1 billion to help expand US submarine production capacity. This drove me crazy, Scott. I thought this was pretty grotesque to hear. This is a guy credibly accused of war crimes over the government's bombing of Venezuelan ships, talking about $1 billion that we are giving to the US to help them build nuclear submarines, while our schools and hospitals are being starved of resources and our ministers are just standing there nodding along like absolute drones. It's like you joke about Australia being like the 51st state and, we're just another...
Yeah, AUKUS is so ridiculous how, we're going to be living with this for, 10 plus 15, 20 years, this conversation, it seems. And despite the fact that, like, the day after the deal was signed, there were very smart people saying these nuclear subs we will never get them. Like, not only are we spending all this money, we will never probably see them. And yet we are just attached like a conveyor belt, going forward with handing over more and more and more money for something that increasingly people know is a disaster already, and we can't seem to have a honest political conversation about it. It's infuriating.
Yeah. The lack of any ability to really talk about it is what is so infuriating. And in terms of the money we're giving, it's probably going to go up, right? Here's the thing. Even though the US is already getting $400 billion out of us, they want even more. Hegseth and Trump are on this mission to get the US's allies to keep increasing defense spending. So on top of the $400 billion we're giving the US for AUKUS, Hegseth wants Australia to increase our general annual defense spending to 3.5% of our total GDP. It's currently between 2 and 3%. That is hundreds of billions of dollars more going to defense spending under the US's demands. And when that money goes to defense spending, what that really means is it goes to US weapons companies, right? This is how this stuff works.
And can I also mention the other thing about it is even the ways in which the government can go, oh, well, we're spending this small amount of it on capacity here or whatever. The whole idea here is that all that capacity building, quote unquote, we're doing here is for American designs of American weapons that fit in with the American war machine that can supply back to America. And even money that is sort of said to be for domestic jobs or industry or whatever is just making us completely dependent on American weapons companies and the American system.
Yeah, absolutely. And And the thing is, like, this is probably likely to happen. And by that, I mean, like, this increased commitment to spending more. And, Miles has sort of hinted at having even more US presence on Australian soil. Both Wong and Miles were very, very cagey when they were asked about the recently completed Pentagon review into AUKUS. It seems like that's never going to be made public, which is bizarre, considering this is the most money Australia has ever spent on anything. And the fact, to me, at least, Scott, that they don't want to talk about it in detail and they go over into this press conference but don't talk about specifics suggests that this probably is not going to be great for Australia. They know people are going to be frustrated, which to me suggests that it is going to end up being us forking over more money to the US for less. It does feel like this is where this is going.
Totally. I have to say, actually, here, credit to Michael Koziol, who, in his piece, the news lead of that was that Miles refused to say what this AUKUS review by the Trump administration said. He was asked 12 times and refused every time, and just kept saying that the Trump review was about ways to do AUKUS better. And the SMH and the Age have generally been huge fans of AUKUS, but credit for making that the news story, because it is a news story. Like, does do AUKUS better mean that we spend more money than we've already committed? Does it mean we spend that money faster and move forward when we pay that? Like, the public doesn't get to know, apparently, which is just ridiculous, Oz.
It's outrageous. So that trip and the kind of AUKUS-related conversations around it was reported on quite heavily by the Australian media. But, Scott, there was another big US foreign policy announcement, a huge one, really, that I think is closely related to us and our alliance with the US, that didn't receive as much coverage. And the coverage it did receive, I think, missed some of the most significant issues. So every few years, the US government unveils something called the National Security Strategy, which outlines how the country plans on engaging with the world and its key foreign policy priorities. The last one under Biden, for example, released back in 2022, focused mainly on the threats posed by Russia and China to the US and their kind of vision of the world. The new strategy released by Trump just last week is markedly different. Firstly, it is way less concerned about projecting US power in Asia or trying to counter China. It's almost entirely focused on what they call the Western hemispheres, the West, particularly Europe, and what the Trump administration sees as threats to, quote, Western civilization. In other words, traditional white European culture. In fact, the entire document is essentially a white nationalist manifesto, and you can see the influence of people like Stephen Miller, a key Trump advisor, who's an advocate for that kind of ideology throughout this strategy. For example, it identifies migration as the single greatest security threat to the West. It is riddled with references to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which is this far-right idea that governments are bringing in immigrants to prop up their vote and their support. It actually has a paragraph explicitly talking about that idea. It talks about other far-right talking points like declining birth rates and the loss of, quote, national identity, the changing character of European countries, all this racially coded stuff that essentially boils down to they think Europe is letting in too many non-white migrants and that is bad. Now, these kinds of conspiracies and white supremacist beliefs are obviously concerning whoever says them, right? Whether an activist says them, whether the media says them, it's not good. But the fact that this is now laid out in official US government policy, the policy of our closest ally, who this week we just re-pledged our allegiance to, is insane and I think very, very troubling. And one of the most concerning parts of this document, Scott, is it's not just a statement of beliefs and values. It goes further, and it appears to suggest that the US will actively intervene in domestic European politics to support political parties that align with their white supremacist vision for the world. That means parties like Nigel Farage's Reform in the UK, Marine Le Pen in France, and the AfD in Germany. This is dark, dark stuff.
Yeah, you sent me the actual PDF of this document, and I was shocked reading it. You know, a lot of that stuff about migration and birth rates is under a heading Promoting European Greatness. That's a heading, and it talks about, when it talks about these parties you mentioned, it says, quote, the growing influence of patriotic European parties indeed gives cause for great optimism. I assume that they're talking there, Oz, about parties like the PVV in the Netherlands and AfD in Germany, who want, Oz, something called remigration, which means deporting even citizens if they are non-white. That is what these kind of parties want. Deporting citizens who are non-white out of these countries. It is absolutely white supremacist. And you have our ally saying it is their goal. The goal of the world's superpower is now promoting European greatness. And we are signed on to that. They're our great ally. You know, Albanese and Wong and all these people talk about this being the most important relationship we have and going around promoting our alliance with that strategic aim now in black and white. It is so disturbing.
It's really bad. And like so much of this language does evoke that kind of first wave of fascism in the 1930s, particularly this talk about traditional European values. And, you know, like the only thing that stopped the rising tide of fascism that emerged in Europe in the 1920s and 30s was literally World War II. And now you have the US, like one of the biggest antagonists against fascism in that war, openly aligning itself with fascist parties. I just don't know how this stops. Scott, obviously, I wanted to, and I think there maybe is a way, otherwise I'll just give up. But it does seem like we are increasingly getting closer to, you know, we used to joke about this, like people like me being sent to camps or whatever. It's like, this is now the policy of the United States government and what they're encouraging throughout Europe. It's really, really bad.
And the shocking thing to me, Oz, as well, was before you drew my attention to this, I saw that the Trump administration had released a new national security policy. I had no idea this European stuff was in there until you texted me about it. I haven't seen this reported anywhere.
Yeah, and that to me is as significant as the statement itself. It really didn't get much coverage, particularly in Australia. And I found that surprising, particularly since literally a couple of days later, our two most powerful ministers went to the US to talk to the Secretary of State about international affairs. The ABC, as far as I could tell, online ran one wire story from Reuters about this strategy, and that focused mainly on Russia supporting it. It didn't talk about Trump's vision for a Europe that was more dominated by the far right. The SMH and the Ages coverage largely focused on the economic aspects of the strategy and the little it had to say about the Pacific. It had one paragraph that referenced the government's focus on migration and the loss of, quote, European identity. It was really odd to see how little coverage there was. And like you, I think if you're a normal person who reads the Australian media, even regularly, you would not have any idea of how significant and radical this was. And to talk about some of the coverage in detail, one thing that I noticed that has started to concern me quite a lot, and it really accelerated in the last couple of days around a couple of stories that did talk about this strategy. The way that certain language has become normalized in the mainstream press in Australia, particularly how they are talking about migration, and the way that white nationalist language has become normalized in news copy in Australia. One example I want to talk about is the increased use of the term mass migration, right? This started as a far-right talking point. In Australia, it's a favorite of One Nation, the campaign group Advance, Tony Abbott, Jacinta Price. In the US, it's people like Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller. It's designed to evoke a very specific image of hordes of scary brown people running across the border. And it is used very liberally throughout this US national security strategy. When the Sydney Morning Herald report on the term, Scott, they're not using it as a term used by Trump. They're not quoting it as something that the far right say. It's just become a term that they use like it's a real, actual thing that we should all be talking about. And in the story I mentioned, that the one story that they originally wrote about the strategy document, mass migration as well as collapsing birth rates and loss of national identity in Europe are stated as issues of fact rather than very ideologically charged and racist ideas being pushed by the far right.
So not in quotes.
Not in quotes, not in quotes. And in another story published on Tuesday, the SMH again referred to this idea of European countries having embraced mass migration, stating that as a issue of fact, as a statement of fact, rather than a quote or a far-right talking point. And in a third story, this time by the European correspondent for the papers, David Crowe, he used the term in normal copy, not as a quote, again, not suggesting it's a contested argument, just a statement of fact, followed by, these concerns around mass migration, tap into public anxiety in Europe about social change. So kind of adding extra context to bolster validity around the term. And then he even followed it up with these statistics that seemed designed to buttress that argument. It was really unclear what point they were trying to serve. It just sort of said, there are these concerns about mass migration, and here are some stats about how many migrants there are that now live in Europe. In the UK, Crow says migrants as a proportion of the population increased from 13.4% in 2011 to 16.8% in 2021. In France, he wrote, immigrants made up 10% of the population in 2021, but back in 1968, that was just 6.5%. Okay, so the number of migrants has increased in European countries. Presenting that data immediately after talking about mass migration seems designed to support that argument, but like without any context about the history of why that might have occurred. You know, in the last 10, 15 years, the UK's involvement in wars in the Middle East that sparked the refugee crisis is probably a factor behind that. The French example is even more funny by picking 1968. I don't know if Crow actually has any idea the relevance of that year, but you know, the rapid rate of decolonization across the world in France's ex-colonies probably led to an increase of migration there. It's just really bad journalism to just present those numbers in that context without any other information. Just really normalizes heinous stuff that is becoming really worrying.
Yeah, let alone, you know, things that I think when immigration was sort of first a major issue in the early 2000s, I feel like the media learned to caveat that, you know, like a lot of this immigration that is an apparent rise is coming from, you know, like, is people from the UK moving to France? Is people from, and that's sort of flattening it to be, as you say, this image of sort of like hordes of brown people coming, when actually there's like a whole lot of Brits who are pissed off about Brexit and buying up their cheap villa in Spain or Italy or whatever. That's super, super concerning when you have an ideological agenda by our ally put down like that to encourage anti-migration politics across Europe, and that's the level of kind of interrogation or comprehension of what that means.
Yeah, I mean, do I think that the executive editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, former Daily Mail Australia editor Luke McElveen, thinks carefully about the language used when it comes to migration in this context? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Like, I just don't think that, as important as these issues are, the most senior and powerful people who dictate how our papers cover this stuff are really taking the time necessary to think about the consequences of their reporting. All right, after the break, Scott, the social media ban is finally here, but the government is too busy talking about politicians' expenses to really prosecute its argument, and an update on the Warner Brothers sale and how it'll impact the future of TV and film.
We've been living through a bit of a newsletterification of journalism, I'd say, over the last few years. In many ways, I think it's mostly been incredible. You know, so many journalists have been able to set up newsletters, go independent, find an audience themselves. You know, there's very famous journalists who've done it all over the world. Here in Australia, an old colleague of ours, Royce Kermelovs, has a great newsletter. There's Ben Lee and his partner, Ione Skye, who I believe gave Lamestream a rap in their newsletter.
But at the same newsletter.
Great newsletter, great people. At the same time, some people have lost their minds. A former fave of mine, Matt Taibbi, back in the day, has gone completely insane since he started a newsletter. But there's exciting news, in the world of newsletters. There's another competitor on the scene, another colleague in the world of newsletters. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced this week that he's joining Substack. He's the first world leader to join the platform. What do we think of Prime Ministers getting into the newsletter game, Oz?
Oh, God, Scott. I don't know whether this is like a worse L for Keir Starmer or for Substack as like a company, or for the entire concept of newsletters. As people who run a newsletter, it's distressing to see. I mean, Keir Starmer, who wants this? Who like, presumably everyone in the UK who already hates him. Like, he's in government and the Labour Party's polling like 15%. It's crazy. People hate this guy. Who wants to read his Substack? I don't get it.
It's such a funny to go from like historic Labour win to within 12 months, like looking like the party will be absolutely annihilated next election, and you're like, what is the solution to this? A Substack. And just on the writing front, Oz, it was quite a start from Sir Keir. I want to read you a bit of it where he talks about why he is doing it.
Please only read me a little bit of this, Scott.
He wrote, quote, "People have the right to know how decisions that affect them are taken and why, full stop. And I believe all politicians should explore innovative new ways to do that, full stop. So in this Substack, that's what I will be doing, full stop. Showing you a little bit of what life is like in number 10, full stop. But mainly just explaining the various decisions I try to take and create a Britain which is built for all." What? There are so many sort of like adverbs in there. It's like know, how, why, I try, like there's nothing in there. It's so, I don't know, like an AI being a politician writing a Substack. The prose out of this is going to be incredible alone.
Yeah, I just want to write to you about my ideas. It reminds me of, it's like the modern version of that bit from The Thick of It, 20 years ago when the minister makes a blog, or like, he's like, I'm going to start a blog.
Yes.
That's how you reach normal people. It's literally that, except that is a TV show parodying politics, and this is the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland doing it. It's wild.
Who knows if Keir will be the first? He may be the last. Oz, let's get into something a bit meatier, which is we talked about the teen social media ban on Monday's show. It came into effect yesterday. It's already weird. Like, one example for you, I tried to log onto Blue Sky on Wednesday morning. Now, Blue Sky isn't covered by the ban, is not covered, has no requirements, but it made me enter my birth date to log in on Wednesday morning. So just like an example of that I thought I'd share of how all of us are being asked to hand over more and more data than we were a week ago, even if we're over 16. I also found this week, Oz, it's pretty funny, the 9 newspapers had an exclusive poll on people's thoughts about the teen social media ban, and it led with the findings that less than a third of parents would fully enforce the ban. And in that report, it said, quote, 53% said they would pick and choose what their child could access, and they would review parental controls. Oz, they can't pick and choose. That is the point of the ban. They do not get a choice. The E-Safety Commissioner and the government decide, and parents have no choice. Like, parents can say, I want my kid to have a YouTube account. I trust them on that platform. It lets them save their favorites, and so they get served like more Minecraft videos or whatever. Too bad. The platform has to kick them off, and they can only access YouTube generically. It doesn't matter whether parents trust them. So I think what was just interesting reading that is it shows even the media understand these laws pretty poorly to sort of not include that in the article. Just be like, oh, parents are going to want to pick and choose when it comes in. Well, they can't. Like,
Too bad.
maybe
The government made
clarify
sure that wasn't possible. Sorry, everyone.
And also, I wanted to reassure our listeners, if they've been following our coverage, that I guess, look, particularly I am not crazy on my fixation on Whipper. It has now been established by other sources. Cam Wilson at Crikey proved the influence that Whipper has in a great article published this week by Crikey. The most stunning 2 bits for me in this Oz on Whipper's influence is that, first of all, the entire idea of banning kids until 16 came from a single offhand, unplanned conversation. This clip is from a podcast where one of the people involved in Whipper's campaign, this guy Greg Atwells, tells the story of how Whipper just came into an unrelated meeting. They weren't supposed to be talking about this. He just came in and he was really frustrated that his teenager was on Snapchat and he was getting really worked up about it. And then this happened in the meeting.
And the next question was, well, I wonder if we could change the law. So as soon as we said that, Whipper gets out his phone and he calls Dom Perrottet, the former New South Wales Premier, and he said, hey, Dom, we're thinking of starting a campaign to raise the age that kids can access social media from 13 to 16. What do you reckon?
Oz, it is crazy that that's how a policy was made that the government just adopted wholesale. Like, no experts in that room, no studies, just Whipper walking into a meeting with a bit of a gripe, a bee in his bonnet, and then a call to a Liberal politician, off to the races. Here we go.
It would
Adopt the
be
policy.
crazy if we hadn't documented the numerous times that such important policy is just made literally by crazy radio hosts calling up the politician mates.
Totally. And this report also charted kind of how big corporate sponsors like Hyundai and Kit Kat fueled the campaign, and how that was really the focus of Whipper and his brains trust. And it even led to Kit Kat driving a sign around Parliament during the lobbying effort that said, quote, "Take a break until you're 16."
Oh, God. I mean, this is even more. This is worse, Scott. You're revealing that it's not just commercial radio hosts and News Corp. It's also the brain genius advertising execs. Like,
Yeah.
what have we done here? What have we done here?
And like, obviously, like Kit Kat and those people are in it because they think it's good press to be on board
Yeah.
with this. They lump on more pressure. Like, just staggering the number of people contributing to this who are not involved in policy and not involved in community. It's mind-boggling.
And I know this is the obvious, like, dunk, but it bears repeating, right? As of this week, kids can't go on social media. They can watch the footy or the cricket and be bombarded with gambling advertising, even though the government said it was going to ban it. Like that, everyone else saying it, it's like a popular thing. I'm not trying to claim that I've come up with that comparison at all. It's out there, but it is still incredible to me that is the dichotomy that has emerged. The other bit of this that has been more funny to watch, as people have been covering this for a while, so much of the most intense focus and media coverage on this kind of didn't really kick off until this week when everyone realized what was going to happen. I do think now that it's here, a lot of people who've not paid any attention are going to lose their minds when they figure out how far-reaching it is and how it's going to impact everyone, not just teenagers. That is going to lead to, I think, some pretty funny conversations. But Scott, the lead up to the introduction of this ban has really been overshadowed politically by this expenses affair that has engulfed the government, particularly the communications minister, Annika Wells, who is responsible for the social media ban. In a week where she should have been out there selling it, explaining it, she was on the back foot after it was revealed that she and a couple of her staff members had spent $100,000 on flights to New York, and details of a very nice dinner that they had also made their way into the media. That has then snowballed into a much bigger story about expenses and entitlements more generally. In particular, this family benefit politicians have to bring their spouse or their children with them to events. Wells was being raked over the coals over using that expense to bring her family to 3 AFL Grand Finals, 2 Boxing Day Test matches, and the Formula One Grand Prix. Now, all of this stuff, Scott, is within parliamentary guidelines, but I guess there is so much antipathy towards politicians. It gives this impression of them having their snouts in the trough, and it's generated quite a bit of heat and a lot of coverage. I think the problem with expenses stories from a political perspective... The problem with expenses stories from a political perspective is that it's very rarely just like one politician or one side of politics that gets caught up in it. And as soon as it kicks off, people start flinging mud in the opposite direction. And that is what has happened here. Every journalist in Canberra is going through everyone's expenses and seeing what they can dig up, aided and abetted by dirt units in everyone's office. And it's kind of ensnared everyone. And one particularly funny example occurred on Monday when the opposition communications spokesperson, Melissa McIntosh, smelt a bit of blood. Wells was under a bit of pressure in a big, important week. She went out and slammed Wells for her use of entitlements, saying she was spending taxpayer money like it was confetti, saying it was beyond what was acceptable within the guidelines. But just a few hours after that, Scott, it turns out it was revealed that McIntosh had used the same entitlements to fly her son from Sydney to the Gold Coast, where he took part in a judo competition. Right? So this is the problem when you try to get holier than thou in politics when it comes to entitlements. And I'm keen to get your take on this. Like, I think entitlement stuff is a really funny category of political scandal because the actual sums involved are pretty small in the context of the budget, and most of this stuff is like within accepted guidelines. I think the reason why it becomes a story and why people get frustrated about it is more to do with like how much we hate politicians and politics right now and think they are lazy and useless. Like I think if we thought the government was good and they were trusted and they're doing great stuff, I don't think people would care that much about them spending a few $1,000s on hanging out with their family on a particular trip. What do you reckon?
Yeah. Like, controversially, I sort of usually find these stories a bit kind of like moral panicky, sort of like, oh, these political fat cats. And I'm sort of like, well, you know, like, I kind of want a minister to, like, I don't know, be able to, like, if they're flying overseas to meet another minister or something, to not be getting off like a flight where they haven't been able to sleep and somebody's ass has been in their face all flight. Like, I kind of want them to be able to. So some of it I find it a bit sort of like, yes, us wanting to bring these people down a peg and not really that helpful to them performing their jobs. I think, though, this story actually crossed the line to being genuine for me because, you know, after that first flight was revealed, I was like, oh, is there anything here? And then after it sort of came out, these AFL Grand Final flights for the family, the test matches, you know, in Melbourne where Wells is not from, you know, she's up in Brisbane and her family's flying down to Melbourne to meet her there for those events. And you suddenly go like, oh, I actually think this is not a good look to be doing this. And then her being on trips where other ministers paid their own way. There was a birthday party of a Labour figure and sort of Tanya Plibersek and others paid their own way during that trip, but Wells had put it on the entitlements. And you go, oh, you know, there is a line here. And I think this has become a genuine scandal at this point.
Yeah, I think the other thing going on here is a bit of a proxy battle for the media and press gallery versus the Albanese government. And it's something we've talked about before, just how much power and authority the government has at the moment. You know, Albanese hasn't really been hit by many scandals. And most governments in their first term, there's something that goes wrong, right? Like something happens, a minister's got to resign. To be clear, like there have been things that have gone wrong, but Anthony Albanese has taken the approach of, I'm not going to cave in. I'm not going to sack ministers because of a bit of media pressure. And I think it's been hard for the media to find their way to push back or to land a blow on the government. And I think with Annika Wells, they think that they're getting close to something. And it's an interesting test, you know. In 2025, when the media is as fragmented as it is, when people are paying less attention to the political news, can these stories generate enough heat that make the government think this is really biting amongst regular people and have to take action? I don't know the answer to that, Scott, but I think it will end up revealing a lot about the balance of power between the government and the media, and really whether Albanese can think he can just essentially post his way through it. My kind of take at the moment, and I'm not pretending that I've got some sort of like amazing connection with Middle Australia, I just don't think either the issues themselves are scandalous enough to have really bitten in, you know, but I don't think the issues are scandalous enough to have really become a top-line concern for voters. And I also just think the main issue is not enough people read mainstream political news these days. So I think Albanese thinks that he can dig in. There might be some review of family expenses just as a way to kind of cauterize it, but I don't think Annika Wells is going anywhere.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Labour is riding so high in the polls right now from their point of view that I do think Albanese and the government could just, as you say, post through it. But I think the point you raise is really interesting. Like, it is a real test of how much juice the Canberra Press Gallery has, how much they can prosecute something. Because in another era, you would think that this is probably a sort of scalp for the media, which is, I know people might find it a bit gross that journalists think like that, but it probably would be. And so it is a fascinating test and milestone to go, do they have the juice to prosecute this case anymore?
And then the kind of the stakes are actually a lot higher than the Wells scandal, because even if this is like not a great look, but it's not like anything criminal or anything even really outside of the rules, it raises questions of like, okay, if there is a genuine scandal, like if there's more serious concerns about another minister, is the lesson from the government, well, actually no one cares anymore, so we can just kind of keep going and doing whatever we want? That raises some bigger questions about democracy and the rule of law. Scott, the last thing I wanted to talk about is an update on the Warner Brothers takeover. We spoke on Monday. We spoke on Monday about Netflix acquiring the company, and the negative to disastrous impact that was likely to have on the future of film and TV production, as well as increased prices on streaming platforms. There's been a couple of developments since then. The first big one is that Paramount, the other studio owned by David Ellison, the right-wing pro-Israel, pro-Trump billionaire, has made a bid for a hostile takeover. They're offering more money than Netflix, and the interesting thing about this bid, Scott, is that it is bankrolled by a bunch of Gulf states and Jared Kushner's investment firm. Jared Kushner is obviously Trump's son-in-law. Great stuff happening over there.
Unbelievable.
And the same time that's happening, something you alluded to, Scott, Trump has expressed some concern about the potential for Netflix to take over Warner Brothers. He said that it could give the company too much market power. Now, why that's relevant is because ultimately the US government will end up playing a deciding role here, because any merger has to be approved by them. And now we've got these two competing bids. You would imagine that Trump is more likely to be supportive of the Paramount bid because of his relationship to Ellison and Kushner. And as well as that, it's been reported by the Wall Street Journal that Ellison, as part of his attempts to curry favor with Trump, has promised an overhaul of Warner Brothers' news properties, particularly CNN, which is a channel that Trump despises. So
Yeah.
there's a way to go, but like the takeaway for me, Scott, is this. I said the word crazy so many times this episode. Like, we talked a while ago about Trump helping greenlight Rush Hour 4. That was a silly and relatively inconsequential like development. But seeing the entire news and entertainment industries being restructured to become more monopolized, to be run by a handful of tech oligarchs, at the same time as they're being forced to toe the line of Trump's personal vision and values, this is an insane, crazy moment. All I want is good movies. And Warner Brothers had a couple of great movies this year. You know, they had Sinners. They had one battle after another. They gave PTA a big check. This is good stuff. I just want that to keep going. I don't know how we've ended up with Trump somehow being in charge of the future of Warner Brothers and likely helping flog it off to his right-wing billionaire mate. I can't fucking handle any of this stuff anymore.
Do we think PTA is getting a massive check to make any more films about like a violent resistance movement to a white supremacist America after this merger goes through? I don't think so.
Seriously,
Yeah,
exactly.
seriously.
And like, you know, is Ryan Coogler, you know, the very political black director of Sinners who got this great deal that a lot of people in Hollywood lost their minds about, like, is he going to get the resources to make the kinds of movies he wants to make under a fucking David Ellison regime or even a Netflix regime? It is not too much to just want good things.
Totally. And I think the thing about this is just, it is going to be bad whoever wins this bid, whether Paramount or Netflix wins it. It is just bad that our popular culture, our news and information is in fewer and fewer hands. There is less and less competition. It makes it easier and easier for the owners to fire, bully out, get rid of anyone who wants to make trouble, who wants to do things differently, who wants to get interesting ideas on screen. It makes it easier for them to do that because those people can't walk across the road to a competitor, as we said. I think the even worse thing about the current situation, Oz, which you mentioned, is I think probably what is going to happen is Trump is going to sit there and see who kisses the ring the most. He's being he's hedging his bets a lot. He's sort of saying, I have concerns about, this, I have concerns about that. And I think it's obvious he is just waiting to see who kisses the ring the most, including if that means, CNN, a huge thorn in his side, gets the kind of Paramount treatment and gets Barry Weist or something. Concerning times, Oz.
I mean, like Barry Weiss could end up being the editor-in-chief of CNN as well as CBS as part of all of this. You know what you can do to stop that? You can support independent media and subscribe to support Lamestream, the little outpost doing everything it can to fight back against David Ellison and Barry Weiss. That is it from us for this Thursday. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left us a review or shared it with a friend. Remember to email us questions for our mailbag episode over summer. contact@lamestream.com.au. Thank you to our producer Bez, our video producer Schwen. Thank you to you, Scott. See you back here on Monday.